Hi there. I hope you've had a good week. Now, before we dig into one chapter of Miroslav Volf's fascinating and accessible short text, free of charge, about forgiveness, let's review. Our thesis for this module is Bonhoeffer's theological transformation in Haarlem provides us with an exemplar for racial reconciliation in our day. In the prior video, you did at least 4 cool things. First, you established some basic context for Reggie L. Williams and his subject Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Second, you analyzed the difference that Williams sees between Bonhoeffer's Volk theology in his early period prior to 1930 and the Bonhoeffer that emerged after 1930-31 from his experiences in Haarlem. Third, you interpreted Williams's argument concerning the ways that the Haarlem Renaissance shaped Bonhoeffer's theology into one of incarnation and empathy. Fourth, you evaluated Williams' analyses of W.E.B. Du Bois's short manifesto Credo and his parable Jesus Christ in Texas, as well as County Cullen's evocative, empathic poem The Black Christ, in terms of their import for Bonhoeffer's new paradigm of race and theology. That's a lot to have done in a short space, and you should feel proud. Now, in this video, we'll augment our thesis using Volf. To clarify that thesis, again, we have 5 specific goals this time. So first, after creating very basic context for Volf, you'll interpret his careful distinctions amongst revenge, justice, and forgiveness in his 5th chapter. Second, you'll analyze his portrait of forgiveness in particular. Third, you'll evaluate his argument concerning memory and forgiveness. Fourth, you will examine his paradigms of restitution and reconciliation. I'll define those later. And fifth and finally, you'll inquire how Volf's ideal of forgiveness can apply to Bonhoeffer's transformative revelation and work in Haarlem, as well as to us. Let's dive right in, shall we? First, we want to think through a little of Volf's context. Then I'll guide you as we interpret Volf's distinctions between and among revenge, justice, and forgiveness. So Miroslav Volf, whom you can see on the slide there, is the Henry B. Wright Professor of Systematic Theology at Yale University, as well as the founding director of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. Volf is Croatian originally. He got a Bachelor of Arts in Theology from the University in Osijek in Croatia, I hope I'm saying that right, as well as an MA from Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena, California, and he did doctoral and postdoctoral work in Tübingen in Germany. Dr. Volf has written or edited more than 20 books and 90 scholarly articles, including Exclusion and Embrace, a seminal book on reconciliation and forgiveness, After Our Likeness, which is a neat book about the Trinity, and many others, including Free of Charge, from which we're reading now. Volf has 3 children and lives with his second wife in Connecticut. All that context ought to help us parse what he says about forgiveness. So, in the first instance, Volf recounts a conversation he had with a Croatian woman who was upset with his portrait of forgiveness in works like Exclusion and Embrace. The woman felt that Marshal Tito, the former dictator of Yugoslavia, had ruined her life. So, based on that woman's experience, Volf creates 3 broad categories for dealing with offense. When one is offended, one can get revenge, one can seek justice, and one can forgive. In terms of revenge, Volf notes that with the Croatian woman and his Cuban-American colleague and friend Carlos Era as examples, most people understand the blinding fury that comes from being grievously wronged. He talks about Era's fury at length in particular, but we, most people, also believe that revenge is wrong because revenge acts out of proportion with an offense. Volf states, revenge doesn't say an eye for an eye. It says, you take out my eye and I'll blow out your brains. So, Volf's friend Era, the Croatian woman, and we must learn to kiss the lizard. Now, under the heading, Forgiveness versus Justice, Volf observes that people kiss the lizard they, forgive those who have wronged us grievously, because forgiveness is more natural than what he calls the consistent enforcement of justice, as well as because vengeance is difficult to separate from justice. Moreover, Volf states that retributive justice, a form of criminal justice, where offenders are punished proportionately to their offense rather than rehabilitated, isn't usually enough to satisfy people's spirits. It seems necessary here to quote Volf at length. You can see it on the slide. Revenge multiplies evil, says Volf. Retributive justice contains evil and threatens the world with destruction. Forgiveness overcomes evil with good. Forgiveness mirrors the generosity of a God whose ultimate goal is neither to satisfy injured pride nor to justly apportion reward and punishment, but to free sinful humanity from evil and thereby to reestablish communion with us. So there you have Volf's distinctions in a nutshell. He says that revenge worsens evil because it creates the potential for greater harm. Meanwhile, retributive justice puts a check on evil, it halts it, but it threatens to tear human societies apart because proportionate representation is still too strict. In the meantime, forgiveness allows people to create the possibility for communion and community, and we'll talk about that. Believers who have been wronged, says Volf, can enact forgiveness because we want to see our oppressors reformed even more than we want to see our wrongs redressed. I recognize that this idea may be difficult for us to swallow, and I would love to have your insight on it in your papers or in other discussions. Forgiveness is difficult, so we need to examine it further. Thus, second, let's analyze Volf's paradigm of forgiveness. Quite sensibly, Dr. Volf asserts that we can't forgive exactly as God forgives because we're not God, as prior modules may have made clear to us. Using the example of a young woman seduced into a prostitution ring, Volf suggests that forgiveness is in fact very difficult. But he also notices, as you can see on the slide, that Christians are called to forgive because one of the things Christ has done for us on the cross as our substitute is to forgive our debts. According to part of the tradition, Christ suffers the punishment for all human sin in our place, and we forgive and so imitate God as the instruments of God, as the tools that God uses for the redemption that Wright and Tinker and others have previously described for us. Now, in terms of the structure of forgiveness, Volf observes that God doesn't simply ignore offenses, and he doesn't take a walk in the cool of the day to calm down. Rather, God forgives, and forgiving means, according to Volf, to name and condemn the misdeed. So forgiveness requires calling out what the other person has done wrong. For Volf, that is an integral part of forgiveness. What do you think? How do you see that? Is Volf right to define forgiveness partly as censure of another person's actions? Plus, Volf argues that Dr. Phil and others are incorrect in their assessments of forgiveness. The act of forgiveness is something we do for the other person, not for ourselves. Let's hear Volf at length again so we can get it right. Volf states, and I quote, "Emotional healing is a good thing, and there are many paths that may lead to it, but emotional healing is not the main purpose of forgiveness. To forgive means to forgo a rightful claim against someone who has wronged us. That is a gift we give not so much to ourselves, but to the one who has wronged us, whether we are emotionally healed as a result of that or not." So Volf is saying that Western cultures, like ours, have forgiveness backwards. Forgiveness is a choice we make not to release ourselves from anger and resentment, but to release the ones who wrong us from the debt that they owe us. That is so profound that it makes my head spin, which is why I wanted you to read it. Volf also goes on to clarify that forgiveness is choosing not to press charges against the other person, but to choose to treat the offender better than they've treated us. Plus, when we forgive others, we can release them from guilt as well as debt. Third, Let us briefly evaluate Volf's argument concerning memory and forgiveness. Based partly on a short exegesis of 2 Corinthians 5:14, Volf writes that forgivers' memory implies forgetting the sins that people commit against us, just as God does. Now, maybe anticipating our vehement objections that forgetting sins allows offenders to repeat their offenses, Volf argues that forgiving without forgetting makes our relationships into battlefields, and that choosing not to forget others' offenses allows us to always treat them as evildoers. And that's not fair. Have you ever been there, in that awkward space where you're still remembering other people's offenses? I have. It's definitely not a fun place to be in, or a good place from which to conduct a relationship. Next, Volf discusses God's indiscriminate forgiveness based on that same reading of 2 Corinthians 5. He asserts that because Christ died for all without exception, God is willing to forgive all people, and that, like God, Christians of every stripe are called to forgive every sin committed against them by all people as often as necessary. Lest we think that Dr. Volf is simply opening a metaphorical door again to the abuse of forgiveness by repeat offense, he observes repeatedly that God's forgiveness is scandalous precisely in its universality. Volf states that human beings cannot draw clear boundaries around God's grace because we are not God. Even though we're going to struggle to forgive in the way that Volf is arguing God intends us to, we still ought to try, precisely because Christ forgives us first, both unconditionally and in a way not influenced by our repentance. Last part of memory and forgiveness. Volf claims that repentance is hard because it requires self-examination, but repentance is a necessary consequence of forgiveness. Volf says that because forgiveness is a gift which needs to be received by a party in order to be genuine. Volf argues that God gives believers an appropriate model for their forgiveness of others' offenses. That said, he also gives a number of examples, which I hope you've read and digested on your own, in order to show that repentance is very difficult. Often, offenders, like the Khmer Rouge officials that Volf writes about, or like Esther's mother, are so ashamed of their former behaviors that they can't even speak or totally free themselves from guilt. Volf observes that forgivers, quote, enact a kind of divine love towards their enemies, but both parties must participate in repentance in order for it to be complete. Fourth, in his last major section in this chapter, Volf briefly discusses both restitution, making material amends for an offense, and reconciliation, or enemies becoming friends. So restitution works, claims Volf, if the offender genuinely wants to make amends and makes a sincere effort to rebuild bridges and restore what has been lost. Moreover, reconciliation, forgiveness, the establishment of communion, is both possible and a worthy goal because communion in friendship imitates God. Volf asserts, peace is not the indifference that leads each to his or her own little island unconcerned for and unengaged with others. Peace is the flourishing of the community and of each person within it. He gives an example of a Franciscan monk in Bosnia having coffee with a Muslim woman who had taken over his brother's old house. Maybe, in an ideal world, we can all strive for that kind or level of forgiveness. Fifth and finally, we need to make a few links between Bonhoeffer and Williams's analysis and Volf's concept of forgiveness. Williams has claimed that there existed a racist and Eurocentric theological paradigm with white folks at the top, and that in his own Volk-centered theology, Bonhoeffer was ensnared by that culture. Nonetheless, I assert that despite his initial enmeshment in that nationalistic and civic religion, Bonhoeffer matured spiritually and theologically. He repented in the same terms that Volf has used above. He started to accept his place as a white theologian with privilege, and he began to see his experiences at the Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem as an instance of the gospel. That repentance, in turn, allowed Bonhoeffer to stringently and vehemently critique the Nazi regime, and that same critique applies rigorously to the Covenant, to us, as we do our own work on racism. Whatever ministry you may undertake within the Covenant or any denomination, you will encounter racism and white supremacy, and all of us are called to work to change those evils into good. I can point you to a couple things that my colleague Michelle Clifton-Soderstrom has done at the most recent annual meeting, if you're interested. All right, let's step back and recap. You can see the thesis on the slide. Bonhoeffer's theological transformation in Haarlem provides an exemplar for racial reconciliation in our day. In this video, you accomplished 5 things, I think. After establishing context for Volf, you interpreted his distinctions amongst revenge, justice, and forgiveness. You analyzed his portrait of forgiveness in particular. You evaluated his argument concerning memory and forgiveness, particularly noting that according to Volf, forgiveness is indiscriminate. You examined his paradigms of restitution and reconciliation, and lastly you inquired how Volf's ideal of forgiveness can apply to Bonhoeffer's transformative revelation in Haarlem and to us, noting also the work the Covenant still has to do on racism. I think that's enough for now. When you're ready, please go on to our final module, Module 13. Thank you.